Hi there. Welcome back to the Complicated Kids podcast. I'm your host, Gabriele Nicolet. I am a speech therapist, a parent coach, and a toddler whisperer. And today I am really excited actually to have Tera Sumpter with us. Tera, welcome.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here today.
I'm excited on all the different levels. The first of which is that you are also a speech therapist by training, but have gone in this very specific direction. So, do you want to tell us a little bit about your background and then we're going to jump into our topic?
All right, so I have an unusual background. My background was actually not in speech language pathology until I went back for my master's. My original course of study and what my undergraduate degrees are in is in math and French. So I've always loved language, and but I'm highly analytical. So I have this like crazy math brain. So I'm sort of this weird mix. I went back to school to become an SLP in my mid 20s. I was always looking at our field a little bit differently simply because of my background. I get out, I start practicing, and pretty much right away, I started to feel like I was missing something. I felt like there was a piece of the puzzle with my students that I just couldn't quite pinpoint. And I felt like I was very much band-aiding symptoms instead of getting to like the root of what was going on. So I looked for answers, in our field. I didn't quite find what I was looking for in our field. So very quickly, I moved into the fields of neuroscience, cognitive psychology, occupational therapy. I would say I've spent the last 5 years or so really digging into the field of cognitive linguistics. And it was pretty quick right away, especially in that field of cognitive psychology, where I learned about executive function. And that was 17, 18 years ago. And so those are the fields where I've been living and learning and breathing and taking in all of what I could from those fields, synthesizing it together, and then applying it to my clinical practice. So, what I provide in terms of clinical skills, because I am a clinician. And then also in terms of what I teach, I do present nationally and internationally and have an international best-selling book. And I have a global educational network where I teach thousands of SLPs and educators all over the world. I'm teaching how this executive function system is absolutely paramount to all learning, including speech and language.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Okay. And that brings us to what we're going to talk about. And so before we hit record, I said, what do people, parents notably, but people, clinicians, need to know about executive function that they don't know? And you said something that I didn't know or hadn't thought of in this way. And so, what do people need to know about executive function that they don't really know?
Okay, so what people need to know is that the most commonly identified executive function needs tend to be organization, prioritization, and planning. And these skills are high level executive function skills that very often have a root in a much more fundamental aspect of the executive function system. So the planning, organizing, and prioritizing. So we have the kiddo whose backpack is a mess and they're not turning in their homework and blah, 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 blah. Those are most often symptoms of needs within this, what I refer to as the roots of the executive function system. With the root system, and we have to be able to look past the system, I'm sorry, look past the symptoms and look deeper into the roots to be able to find what that root cause and that root need is for our students who are learning. So things like awareness of our environment, what's called perception, awareness of our environment, awareness of ourselves, attention. Can I self-direct my attention? Again, another huge misconception that attention is sustained. Attention is not sustained. It is simply not. One of my favorite researchers, Dr. Amishi Jha, she is a neuroscientist, studies attention predominantly, and she talks about how even when people are paid, they cannot pay attention. So, attention is not about sustaining it for a long period of time. It's about having the skill to direct it, right?
It's the
Like,
same deal, by the way. This is how all of these things get oversimplified
yes.
in practice, not just in the parlance, but in practice. Eye contact is the same. We
Mhm.
don't sustain eye contact unless we're being very strange.
Yes.
I
Yeah.
recently had this experience where I went to a workshop, and there was an exercise where for 4 minutes we were to sustain eye contact with the person sitting next to them. Never mind that I didn't know them. That was a whole other level of weird. But it was very uncomfortable. And
Right.
so, much is made about like teaching this skill of sustaining eye contact is not a thing. And so I hear you saying the same thing in terms of attention is
Yeah.
sustaining attention, not a thing. Directing attention on purpose, a thing. Yes?
Right. And we think about the application of this to children who have ADHD, for example, right? And I'm hoping at some point in my career, I do see the renaming of this disorder. It is not a deficit of attention. How many of us know kids who have ADHD that can play video games for 8 hours straight? I
Mhm.
sure do, right? I've worked with a whole lot of them.
Yeah.
But then they have difficulty self-directing their attention for non-preferred tasks. That's a totally different type of need, and that is an executive function need in nature. So again, we have this root system, perception, attention, oh my gosh, working memory. That's one of my favorite topics, verbal and nonverbal working memory. And then we have inhibition. These skills, research shows, make up sort of this root system for this entire network of executive function skills that starts developing at birth and continues all the way into our mid late 20s. And so it's this ongoing development. And what's so critical is that this root system has to be in place for learning to take place. So we can't learn speech and language or reading if we're not paying attention or perceiving the people in our environment who are trying to teach it to us. They're
Okay.
becoming huge.
Pause.
Okay.
How many times have I been in a Facebook group and a clinician says, I have a 3-year-old with usually autistic, sometimes ADHD, non speaking generally. They won't pay attention to me. How can I teach them to speak?
Yeah,
And this is exactly what you're talking about, which is
that's exactly what I'm talking about.
they
Yep.
need to be aware of something outside of themselves and be able to respond to it. I think awareness and responding to awareness are two different things, also. Yeah.
100%. Yep.
Before we're going to get any language out of anybody, like, can we, and for me, what that looks like, and I know you have this, we're going to keep focusing on executive function here, but for me, what that looks like is, do I have a relationship with this child?
Mm-hmm.
Like, does this kid even care that I'm in the room?
Mm-hmm.
Right. So like without that, we can't do anything that you're talking about. And with anything that we're talking about, that you're talking about, we can't do anything else. So it's like,
Right.
but
And the relationship can't form if they don't perceive you.
yes.
So if they're not even aware that you're there or that they're not picking up the nuances of who you are, which, oh my gosh, let's talk about the nuances involved in speech and language development, right? So if they're not able to attend and self-direct their attention long enough to pick up the social and linguistic and speech based nuances, then the ability to form a relationship becomes incredibly difficult
Yeah.
for a little person. So again, that idea that we have to perceive, we have to be aware of the objects, the people, the items, the concepts in our world and in our environment, and then also be aware of our own responses and our own thoughts and our own emotions and actions. So that lays the foundation. And we can't even begin to talk about teaching anybody anything until we first address that.
Mm. Okay, just because it interests me, where does emotional regulation fall in this hierarchy of executive function? And what's between, and maybe emotional regulation is one of them, but what's between these foundational skills of perception, attention, and what was the third one?
Working memory.
Working memory, and planning, organization, and strategy, for example.
Oh, it's a whole lot. Okay, so those are two really big questions. So, your first question about emotional regulation. So, here's the thing about the executive function system. The executive function system is this big umbrella of regulatory networks, is a better way to put it. It's not one place in the brain, it's a whole network within the brain. And this executive function network, it regulates and modulates our thoughts, our perceptions,
Mhm.
our actions, and guess what else?
Our
our emotions.
emotions.
So it becomes an application of the system itself.
Mhm.
It's not its own skill. And I don't like that it gets talked about in that way because it's very misunderstood. It's how the whole system is regulating these different parts of ourselves.
I just had an aha moment here,
Oh, I
which
thought it
is
was a hot flash. Okay.
no, I'm not having a hot flash. I take medication for that. Um, okay. We are so busy, and by we,
Mhm.
I mean clinicians usually, and parents sometimes. We are very busy teaching emotional regulation, or we think we
Right.
are, but
Yeah.
we haven't been teaching thought regulation, for
Mhm.
example, or awareness of what one is thinking
Yeah.
necessarily.
Yeah, that'd be
And
perception
so,
itself. Yeah. We
okay,
can't even begin to talk about emotional regulation until we have worked and helped a child develop perception of their interoception. What is interoception? Interoception are the cues that we're getting from inside of our body. So that looks like, little Johnny said something, and what he said made me feel a whole lot of heat within my chest. And that heat that I feel within my chest, that feeling of the heat, is the interoceptive feedback. That's the interoception. So I have to first have perception, awareness around that interoception. Then I can have the thought of, boy, there's a name to this heat, and I call this anger, or I'm mad. And then my thought process becomes, I'm so mad at Johnny, and the action becomes, I'm going to slug him in the face. Okay, so this is like a sequence, a progressive sequence, all really built around perception. Now, if we don't have perception around this sort of sequence, this progression, then we can't pull in other higher level executive function skills, say inhibition, where I perceive the heat, I perceive my thought process, and then my inhibitory system goes, don't slug him because you're not going to like that outcome, right? So
yes.
this whole system works together to modulate all aspects of ourselves, modulate our thoughts, our emotions, our actions, all of it.
And this question of interoception, and by the way, if you want to hear all about interoception, there is an interview with Kelly Mahler, whose work is amazing in this area. On this podcast, she's been on many other podcasts as well. But many folks with neurodivergence of some kind, ADHD, autism, anxiety to some degree, most of us actually have been sort of cut off from the neck up
Yeah.
from our bodies. And so this question of interoception, maybe we've got the basics, but I have talked to a whole lot of adults who, when
Mhm.
I say, what does anger feel like in your body? They have no idea.
Yeah. Yeah.
We have been so conditioned to override, to ignore, and to not pay attention to what's happening physiologically in any given moment. We just kind of want to rationalize it.
Yeah.
And most people can to some degree until they can't. And then that's a whole other conversation. But
Mhm.
kids who are struggling with any kind of neurodevelopmental issue are certainly going to have interoception. Well, certainly, I don't know, you tell me, likely to have some kind of interoceptive difficulty.
Well, we all have interoception, right? So
Right.
interoception is, when I have to go to the bathroom, there's a certain feeling that I get inside my body. When I'm hungry, there's a certain feeling that I get. When I'm stressed or anxious, there's a certain feeling that I get. So this is an eighth sense, right? We have our main five senses, and then we have vestibular, proprioceptive, and interoceptive. So we have these other sensory capacities, and the interoception is just another one. So we all have them. I think the thing that we have to consider when we think about interoception is sensory regulation, or the sensory registry. How we register sensation is different for everybody. So, for example, some people are going to be really hypersensitive to sensory input. So they might be really sensitive to sound. They might be really sensitive to how clothes feel on their body. That might also mean it's not a for sure thing, but they may also be very sensitive to their interoceptive cues. So that when they feel stressed, it feels really strong to them, right? So the sensation that they're getting is really, really strong. And then other people are going to be more hyposensitive. How big that band of registry is different for every person. So again, how we're going to perceive that and feel it can be significantly more intense for some people. And, I think, well, what's interesting about autistic individuals is how there's differences in what they call multisensory binding. We're totally getting off the track of executive function. Sensory stuff. But, in terms of how sensory information gets bound together for one cohesive sort of input, right, to process the world. And it's in that sort of difficulty with the binding that the world can become very overwhelming.
Yep.
But there
Yep.
are definitely differences, based on neurotype for sure.
And so, okay, so interoception, critical piece of executive function, because if I'm
Mhm.
not aware of how I feel, I can't inhibit my actions.
Correct. And I can't self-monitor, which is another. So you asked me about those skills
Mhm.
that are in between the roots and then what I call the flowers. The flowers are the organization, the planning, the prioritization. Balancing is in there. Um, but then I have what I refer to as the leaf skills. And these are sort of the middle of the road that are going to develop kind of first and in conjunction with the roots and the flowers.
Mhm.
So we have skills like self-modulation, which is regulating our intensity level. Turn it up, turn it down,
Okay,
right?
pause for
Yeah,
anybody who knows a 6-year-old. They don't have this yet.
right, right. And they're not supposed to. I mean, it was so funny. I was just flying back for work. I was on a plane a couple weeks ago, and there was a toddler on the plane who was very loud, right? And it was just a reminder that, boy, that self-modulation hasn't turned up yet. And that's normal. That's absolutely normal. This system continues to develop all the way into our 20s. So it takes time. The idea that a 5-year-old is going to have all these skills is just nonsensical. So we have things like self-modulation, cognitive flexibility,
Mm.
self-monitoring, self-correction, time sense, pacing, right? So there's a whole host of skills that have to develop after the roots for us to be able to develop these higher level skills, like being able to create a plan of action for a future goal or to organize. What is organizing? Well, actually, let's take a step back. Prioritizing. What's prioritizing? Prioritizing is holding a whole bunch of ideas in mind and being able to determine importance. But that requires a whole lot of nonverbal working memory, being able to hold it all in our mind to be able to order importance. And then organization puts that even more, heightens that even more. It's holding all of these items in mind, prioritizing them, figuring out which order makes sense, and then creating a system, a plan of action to be able to organize. So it's an enormous amount of cognitive ability. And most people don't understand how complex this is, nor do they understand there's this whole root system that impacts every aspect of child
Well, and
development.
that's really interesting. I mean, two things. The reason this podcast is called the Complicated Kids Podcast is because, yes, the children we're working with are complicated, but human neurology is like, oh my God, but you have no idea how complex it is until you see something that's not working the way it otherwise might,
Right.
right? When the expectation differs so much from reality, that's where we start to see, and that's where we start to have to know about the roots and the stem and the leaves and the flowers versus just looking and being like, oh, nice plant.
Right, exactly.
Right?
Yeah. Or it's so easy to say, like, oh, look, the flowers aren't blooming. And not going, wait, what's happening under the surface and the roots?
Yeah.
That's much harder, and it takes a trained gardener to figure that out.
Ooh, I love it. Yeah. Good extension of the metaphor. Very
Yeah.
nice.
So something that you made me think of is, this idea of complicated kids. Sometimes I use this analogy. I say, these kids will come to my clinic and, the parents will bring the reports and they'll say, these kiddos my child has every diagnosis under the sun. And I refer to it as like the alphabet soup kids, right? They have ADD, ASD, ODD, OCD, LMNOP, right? They have all the things. And what I like to try to shine a light on is that there's usually a connection. There's usually a connection with a lot of these. Let's throw in dyslexia and dysgraphia in there too, right? There's a whole lot of connection there, and we can usually find a connecting thread within the executive function system. And here's why. Because the EF system regulates perceptions, thoughts, actions, and emotions,
Mhm.
that hits a lot of what our kids struggle with. So if we have a kiddo that is struggling with how the executive function system is regulating a whole lot of their learning and a whole lot of their life, they go to one professional who all they do is assess emotions. And that professional says, oh, they have ADHD and ODD. And then they go to somebody who specializes in actions, and then to somebody who specializes in thoughts, and somebody who, and so they're getting all of these different diagnostic labels because this EF system encompasses all of this.
Mhm.
When we break it down, we usually find that there's a need within this root system of the EF system, and all these diagnoses have something in common.
I want you to give us a clinical example. Think of a kid that you've worked with where they came in with an alphabet soup,
Mhm.
and if you can, because I know this stuff is complex and individualized, and but walk us through give us a flyby.
Okay, so let's think about a kiddo. Let's say, I mean, it really doesn't matter the age. I mean, let's say he's middle school, but he could be any age. He could be in college. I've worked with all these ages. And let's say this kiddo comes in and he is still having difficulty in middle school with his literacy skills. He absolutely hates to write. Just absolutely hates the process of writing, stares at his paper, can't get his thoughts down. He does a little bit better in math, but everything is just kind of a struggle. He's working so incredibly hard. Homework takes forever. He might do well on his homework, and then, he goes into the testing situation and just kind of blanks. This kiddo, very likely, I'm thinking of one in my head right now. They come in, and what we find, oh, and this kiddo from an alphabet soup standpoint comes with an ADHD diagnosis, a dyslexia diagnosis, and a dysgraphia diagnosis. Okay. And you could maybe throw dyscalculia in there as well. So it's coming in with all of these diagnoses. Mom and dad feel like they're playing whack-a-mole with these diagnoses. And what we find is that there's a need in the areas of attention and working memory. So what's happening is that he doesn't have the ability to self-direct his attention. He's not even really aware of where his attention is at any given moment. And so then he doesn't have that ability to direct it. And then once the information comes in, his working memory juggler, I like to refer to the working memory system as like a juggler of information. His juggler isn't very strong yet. So his juggler can only juggle about one, maybe two bits of information at a time for maybe 5 to 6 seconds. So he's dropping the information really fast. So he's not getting enough. This child isn't getting enough repetition. And we know academic scaffolds really quickly, but that working memory system needs a lot more repetition in order to learn, and strengthening. Like we can actually strengthen the working memory system, contrary to what research decades ago said.
All right.
Yes.
And so, okay, so now I'm curious. So you work with folks, talk about how do you work with somebody on directing attention and being aware of how they're directing their attention? How does
Yeah.
that work?
How does that work? So what we want to do when we think about working with children with executive function needs is that so executive function, if I had to give you a definition of what it is, executive function is self-cueing or self-directing or self-leading from the inside out.
Mhm.
It starts on the inside of us and it projects outwardly. So if somebody else is doing the cueing, pay attention, look over here, open your book. The other person is acting as the director,
Mhm.
not you, not the individual child. So what our goal has to be is to provide as many opportunities for that child to practice self-directing.
Mhm.
And we can do that with a really powerful technique called reflexive questioning. It's my favorite technique to teach people. So if attention is the issue, right? I'm first going to want to increase their awareness around where their attention is in the moment. Where are your thoughts right now? Or if, with my littles, I might say, where's your attention flashlight shining right now? Right? Where is it? Oh, it's on the birds. And then I might say, where should our thoughts be right now? Oh, they should be on our activity. You're right. They should be on that activity. Can you show me that? Great. And back we come. So now I've increased their awareness of where their attention goes. And then I've given them the tools to bring themselves back, to self-direct that attention instead of me just going, pay attention, pay attention, pay attention, which is a never-ending sequence because it doesn't work. It's not teaching the brain how to self-direct.
Right. And this is where parents of teens that I see are very, very frustrated because, kiddo is 16. For 16 years, I have been, for example, getting them out of bed.
Yeah.
But now that they're 16, now I want them to get themselves out of bed, but they don't have any skill to do so.
Right.
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 Or to
Yeah.
put their own homework away or whatever the skill is, that child has now become reliant
Right.
on the external provider of that cue.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, they've been used to somebody else being their director.
Yeah.
And so when someone else is your director, you don't have to develop your own director.
Yeah.
And that's an issue. And, we think about, for whatever reason, this idea of like boundaries has become a dirty word, and I'm not quite sure why, but having some framework or boundaries for a child in a child's life, whether it's at home, school, whatever the setting is, the boundary itself is what gives a child's executive function system an opportunity to work. Because what happens is when we say, okay, here's the boundary, if you do that again, you're going to lose your phone or whatever it is, right? So the child's coming up to the boundary and the executive function system has to kick in. And what has to happen is executive function operates for future goals. So this is Russell Barkley. A lot of people are familiar with him. He's kind of like this godfather of executive function. His definition of executive function is that it's self-direction for a future goal. So the brain is thinking ahead. It's predicting. It's going, wait, what's the consequence here? Do I like that consequence? Do I want that to happen to me? And it's in that moment that then we can make a choice, that we can practice inhibiting, and there's space built in to inhibit, that then the EF system goes, hey, don't do that. Let's choose a different course of action. So the boundary allows, now, are kids always going to make the right choices? Absolutely not. Why? Because the executive function system is developing for a very long time. So their director isn't great yet, right? They don't have a great director, but they need practice. They need situations where they can do that. And, having some sort of an expectation, maybe expectation's a better word than boundary, whatever people choose. Having an expectation, right, allows that EF system to regulate around the expectation.
Yes. And talk about when that's not working. So you use the example of the phone, like, do I like the consequence that's coming to me if I, whatever, don't get off of media and I know that my phone is going to be taken away for X amount of time? There are kids for whom that boundary is that inhibition is not possible.
Right.
Talk about kind of that situation, because there are parents who continue to sort of basically what they're doing is encouraging failure over and over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about that a little bit here.
Yeah. So what I would do in a case like that is, if we know that meeting the expectation or following through with the expectation is difficult, then we're going to put a plan into place for that. So we're going to create together a sequence of steps for how the child can meet the expectation that works for that situation for them. What is their desired outcome in that moment, right? When we talk about inhibition, so that ability to restrain ourselves or to delay gratification, what inhibition does is it creates space. And that's a really important concept, because we're always thinking about inhibition as just being this stopper of ourselves, which it is. But what it does, what it gives us in our life, is it gives us space to stop and think, okay, here's the action. What do I want my reaction to be?
Yeah.
Here's the thought. What's my response going to be? In social situations, this is huge when it comes to social pragmatics, right? relationships require there to be space for both partners. And inhibition is what creates that space. So inhibition is what allows one person to say something and then you to pause so that I talk and then I pause and create space for the other person to talk. Inhibition is what leads to turn taking,
And
right?
for those of you who are, number one, realizing that, oh, inhibition is really useful for me in an interaction for oneself, right? That's a skill that you use, and possibly you're using it with somebody who is less practiced at that skill. I'm just pausing here for a second to point out that's not self-absorption or ego or narcissism on the part of the other. That's an executive dysfunction, right?
Yeah.
Possibly. I mean,
Yeah.
we can have all those other things too.
Yeah.
But particularly when you've got kids who are info dumping and talking for 15 minutes at a time,
Yeah.
what those kids are showing is that they lack the skill of inhibition, particularly in a conversation.
Yeah. And I love to frame it as a need. So I love to say they have an inhibition need because I feel like when we can frame it as a need, then it allows me to go, oh, I can come in and help that,
Yeah.
right? I can help that need.
Yeah.
A lot of times these kids get labeled as impulsive. And I don't love that. When I'm working with educators and therapists, I always say, you're gonna have parents appreciate you a lot more if instead of labeling their kid impulsive, you say, you know what, they have a need and inhibition, and we can help that. We can do things to support that need.
Well, and it's interesting, and we're going to wrap up here in a second, but it is interesting to describe somebody as being impulsive
Yeah.
versus having a need in the area of inhibition. Those are two really different ways to think about a person.
Well, and that's a great point to bring up and probably a great place to end, that so many kids who have executive function needs are labeled as behavior problems.
Yeah.
So they're lazy, right? That's one of the biggest ones. They're unmotivated.
Pause. No child is lazy. I will
Thank
just
you.
say it and repeat it. No child is lazy. No child is stubborn. No child is unmotivated. They're
Mhm.
motivated by something.
Right.
Figure out what that is.
Yeah, 100%. But these tend to be the behavioral labels that get put on kids who have executive function needs. So, for example, when kids are labeled as lazy or unmotivated, so I start to wonder, okay, so they're having difficulty in some way getting started.
Yeah.
That's initiation.
Yeah.
What is going on with that that initiation need? And so then I wonder, okay, is the need in planning? Are they not great planners? So they don't know, they look at the worksheet or they look at the activity and they're just overwhelmed and they're like, I don't even know where to start. Or maybe they can make a good plan, but the plan doesn't really work for them, right? But they're not good at self-evaluating their plan to make it fit and work for them. These are all executive function skills that at the end of the day, when that director doesn't work well, there are lots of symptoms that we see. And they've so often been labeled as behavior issues. It makes me crazy, right? But that's the easy way out because then it's the kid's fault and I don't have to take any responsibility over it,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but when we position it as a need, then I have to come in as the adult, which we should come in as the people to provide the support.
Oh, we could do this all day long. Tera
Yeah.
Sumpter. If
Yes,
people
we
want to
could.
know, if they want to know more about you, what do they do?
Yeah, so there are two really great places to go to find more about me and what I do. So in my private practice and all of our resources, they can go to terasumpter.com. So it's Tera, so terasumpter.com. You can get everywhere from my website. Another really great spot is my Instagram. So I post regular education on my Instagram page, which is Tera Sumpter _SLP. You can get there from my website as well. We have resources. I talked about that attention flashlight just a little bit. I have a whole guide for parents and for professionals on my website, Shop Tera Sumpter. There's loads of writing resources from an executive function perspective, all kinds of stuff that people can find if they're needing some support.
Love it. And that is for parents and clinicians. So, you
Yes.
clinicians out
Yeah.
there, check it out. We need more people who understand more of this.
Yes.
Um,
Yes. Yes.
Thank you so much for being here today. This was a treat.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate it. It was an honor to be invited to be with you today.
Awesome. Take care.
Thanks.